Hi everyone, my name's Meg Keneally. Welcome to Dymocks Chapter 1, and we are here to talk about Mammoth by Chris Flynn. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Meg. Hello, everyone.
Now, Chris is, as well as the author of Mammoth, is the author of The Glass Kingdom and A Tiger in Eden, which was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize, and he's written for The Guardian, The Age, the Australian Griffith Review, the Australian Book Review. The list goes on, but now he's turned his attention to writing a book from the perspective of a 13,000-year-old extinct mammoth right here. So, Chris, my first question to you is why?
Why write a book from the point of view of Okay, so we only have 30 minutes, unfortunately, or 40 minutes. So I'll try to make it quick. Basically, in 2007, there was a natural history auction in New York. These auctions take place every year, and they often feature the bones of megafauna and dinosaurs, sometimes other bizarre objects like shark's teeth, meteorites, that sort of stuff. And in 2007, there was one that had quite an unusual lineup of exhibits under the hammer. And basically, there was the skull of a Tyrannosaurus bataar, which is the Mongolian cousin to T-Rex. There was the tusk of a mammoth. There was the severed hand of an Egyptian mummy. There was a million-year-old fossilized penguin. There was a pterodactyl, dire wolves, a bunch of other things. And this in itself is not unusual. These auctions often feature these kind of things. But that particular year, there was a bit of a fight began on the phones between some mystery buyers who were knocking up the bidding for the T. bataar skull. And those mystery buyers turned out to be Leonardo DiCaprio and Nicolas Cage, each of them trying to buy the skull to basically put on their wall and show the world, what big men they were.
For the man who has everything.
That's right. And Nicolas Cage, of course, defeated DiCaprio, as he probably would in a fist fight. And he won the skull for $276,000. He only got to hold on to it for a brief period of time because it turned out to be stolen, of course. And he had to give it back, and it was repatriated to Mongolia. But this caught my attention because of the bizarre variety of creatures that were on sale. And then separately to that, I had read that Thomas Jefferson, back in 1800, was doing exactly the same thing. He was looking for mammoth bones and asking people to find him some mammoth bones, showed that he could show the Europeans that America was this, which was a new democracy at the time, was this big, strong, powerful nation where Leviathans once roamed the plains. So it occurred to me that we'd been commodifying, men, especially men in power, had been commodifying these bones, these creatures, for hundreds of years. And I thought this was, and so that's when I thought there's a story here. I just wasn't sure how to tell the story.
And then you've got mammoth having a very, very distinctive voice, and all of the other creatures as well. And you have them all speaking in the sort of, the manner of the time period during which they were unearthed. So Mammoth sounds very courtly and very educated, and I have to say a little bit curmudgeonly. And his interactions with Tyrannosaurus bataar are hilarious because of the contrast in the voices. So tell us a little bit about those two voices and how you managed to write in such a distinct manner for each character.
Yeah, it was a little bit tricky. It took me a while to work out that the book was going to be told in the voices of the actual fossils. Initially, I thought about using human narrators, but it just didn't work very well. And once I realized that the fossils themselves could tell tremendous stories if they could talk, you're right, I came up with the idea of assigning the voices of the fossils according to when and where they were dug up. So the pterodactyl was, although she's, very, very old, millions of years, 100 million years old, was dug up in the 30s by the Nazis. And so she speaks in a German accent. And the penguin spent most of his life hanging over a bar in Boston. And so he speaks in a Boston accent. And the mammoth, you're right, he was unearthed in 1800. So he speaks like a curmudgeonly pretty slightly arrogant, aloof, well-educated American gentleman who thinks he's wiser and better than everyone else. But the T-Batar, even though he's 67 million years old, the Tyrannosaur, he wasn't dug up until 1991, and spent most of his time in a warehouse in Florida. So he learned English, because all the creatures can speak English according to where they lived, and other languages too. So he learned English from warehouse workers in Florida, and so he therefore speaks a little bit like a teenager from the 90s, or maybe a character in one of Keanu Reeves' movies. So it's quite a contrast between him and the Mammoth, who is this wise old statesman trying to tell this very long-winded story. Pretty full of himself, loves the sound of his own voice. Meanwhile, this impatient, almost teenage Rex, Tyrannosaur, keeps interrupting him, telling him to hurry up, telling him that
get to the gory bits.
Get to the action. He just can't be bothered with him. So I thought it was a good contrast to have essentially a very young, almost teenage character speaking with a very old, an old man, if you like. Even though it doesn't really make sense, because the Mammoth is about 13,000 years old, and the Tyrannosaurus 67 million.
Yeah, and there's a fantastic scene where Mammoth is describing, or Mammoth, he'd prefer us to call him, wouldn't he?
Mammut, because that's his Latin name is Mammut americanum. Yeah, and
he insists on referring to all creatures by their Latin names as well. Very, very formal. He's telling the story of a flood, and T-Batar interrupts with the story of the comet, the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, and says, "Look, I know it's not a flood, but I just thought I'd mention it before." Sort of. So he's constantly
trying to one-up each other, really. The Mammoth thinks that his story is by far the most interesting, but the other characters don't really feel that it's as interesting as theirs or as dramatic as theirs, but they're not really getting as much chance to talk about what happened to them. And they also question him as to whether or not what he's telling is the complete truth, which is another little interesting thing that I wanted to play with, this idea that he's an elephant after all, and the idea is that elephants never forget. And so he claims to be able to remember verbatim absolutely everything that's ever happened to him. And exact dialogue from conversations that he overheard. But the other creatures question this, and they say, "Look, I don't even think you could have heard that, or that maybe you weren't there. How do you know that?" And so it plays with that idea of storytelling and history, and the notion that history is, written by, usually powerful men or the victors, but are they always necessarily telling the full story?
Yeah, because the only knowledge we have of the past is through, or most of the knowledge we have of the past is through the eyes of other humans who are going to bring their own biases and perspectives to it. And there are some really heartbreaking scenes in this book that sort of bring you to tears. But and Mammoth is fairly, I think, depressed, isn't he, to be among this world of bipeds and hominids. And through him, we get to see early man and how early man was already having an impact on the creatures around him. Is that something that you wanted to explore?
Yeah, as well as being set around about 1800 to 1804 when the Mammoth was dug up, and which he actually was, like, as much of that was as possible was true in terms of him being on display in Philadelphia. That actually happened, even though they had his tusks upside down. And then they took the mammoth bones on tour to Europe, to France, to show off that actually happened. Later on, part of him is on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis was engaged by Jefferson to go out into the wilderness and have a little side trip to try and find some mammoth bones, or even a live mammoth. But the whole section as well, where he talks about how he died back in the end of the Ice Age.
Yes.
And that was interesting to me, because it is kind of about the origin of human influenced climate change, because the early versions of us, if you like, particularly in North America, the Clovis, who were, one step further than the Neanderthals. They used much more advanced tools. They were much cleverer hunters, and they built habitations rather than just fighting over cave real estate. So they turned up. There were tens of millions of mammoth roaming the steppe, and early man basically wiped them out. And the problem with that was that in destroying all of the animals that lived at the end of the Ice Age, that ended the Ice Age, because they were essentially keeping the ground cold. There were tens of millions of these huge creatures stomping around the north of the world. At that time, the whole north of the globe was one big steppe. You could spend your entire life walking around it in circles. And it didn't really rain. It was quite cold and dry, and the mammoth kept the ground cold by stomping on it. So once they were killed and they were gone, everything started to get warm. And that was the beginning, 10, 12,000 years ago, of the climate changing. So I wanted to look a little bit at the origin of our influence on the world, in terms of our influence being fairly negative, because we're quite an aggressive addition to the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and I never knew that about the mammoths compacting the snow. But I know that you're aware of a project that's happening at, I think, Harvard, to potentially try to address this. There's an interesting little side path to go down.
Yes, the book sort of goes into it towards the end. It's not giving anything away because it's actually happening in the world. So currently there are 3 teams of synthetic biologists around the world who are working on bringing the mammoth back to life. So there is Dr. George CHRIS, who's working at the Harvard Woolly Mammoth Revival Team. And what he's doing, he is adapting the DNA of an African elephant to make it so that it can live in a cold climate. So essentially creating a fake mammoth, if you want. Whereas there's a team in South Korea and one in Shenzhen, China, and they have mammoth DNA, because the huge irony about all this is that the Siberian permafrost is melting, and what's thawing out of the permafrost are millions of mammoth bones. A lot of, and of course, mammoth tusks are huge pieces of ivory, so they're very valuable, and it's totally legal to pick them up and sell them. And incidentally, that's sort of cutting down on the numbers of elephants being poached every year as a result. But they unearthed a complete carcass in 2006 from the permafrost, and it stank. Wow. Its flesh was still quite raw, and in fact, one of the first men to dig it out, and you can see this on documentary footage, the first thing he did was eat it. He actually ate a piece of this.
Really?
He actually ate a piece of this 10,000-year-old
meat,
raw meat, because he wanted to be the first person in millennia to say that he'd eaten mammoth.
Was it worth it?
I think it tasted like chicken. He also
Mammoth would be most offended.
Yes, I mean it's actually taboo in Siberia to go near these creatures. The locals believe you shouldn't touch them, that you'll be cursed if you do. But anyway, they collected some blood because it was also bleeding, the carcass, which means they had viable.
After 10,000 years.
Yep. So they've got viable DNA, and the team in Shenzhen is currently working on cloning a mammoth back, in the lab. And the idea is that
it's just amazing.
Well, it is, but it's troubling as well. The idea is that they want to create a bunch of them in the lab, and then create a small herd who will be raised initially by African elephants. And then once there's enough of them, they will breed naturally, create a major herd. And the idea is to release them in rewilded areas of Siberia that are being prepared with the intention of them essentially doing their job again and stomping the ground and trying to restore the melting permafrost. So it's an incredible left field, a mad scientist solution to, they're not going to solve climate change, but if they can at least slow down some of the some of the melting process, then they might buy us some time. I mean, we need probably a little bit of time to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and plastics and so on. It's not something that's going to happen overnight because we're incredibly stupid. So yes, it's interesting that the mammoth, a dead creature, will probably come back to life sometime in the next few years. We will see baby mammoth, and that's going to be obviously a big step forward in scientific thought, and also just ethics and the emotional lives of everyone on Earth, because these are creatures that we made extinct 10,000 years ago. And
then we bring them back.
And we're going to bring them back in order to try and address the mistakes that we made in the past. And
by killing them off in the first place.
Right. And the other bizarre thing about it is that we're not bringing new creatures into the world. These are actual creatures that we killed, like the actual ones, because they're clones. They're basically new versions of those creatures. And the scary thing about that is we just don't know, what will happen and how they will feel, these creatures. I mean, will they be, if it's the same creatures or identical versions of the same creatures, will they have memories of the last time they were here?
Yeah.
Will they dream of the last time that they walked the earth? And someone in the Sue in the comments there, I've just seen, she said, "I'd pay good money to see a baby mammoth." That's the thing, isn't it? That's the crux of it. If they do create a version of Jurassic Park with megafauna,
there you go. Samantha says it's like Jurassic Park.
Exactly. I mean, no one's going to be able to resist that, right? If someone said to you, "Hey, do you want to go to Pleistocene Park," which is what it's actually already called, this area of Siberia.
Oh, you're kidding? It's actually really already called that.
It's already called Pleistocene Park. There's already acres and acres of land being rewilded, and who wouldn't be able to resist the idea of seeing these long dead creatures, right? I mean, we're pretty far off from Jurassic Park territory because we don't have viable DNA to recreate dinosaurs, but if they can do it one day, they probably will.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And I mean, what's extraordinary about your book as well is, as we were touching on, even though we have this fossil narrating it, this long dead creature narrating it, I read you estimating somewhere around 80% of what's in the book is actually real.
Yes.
Actually happened.
Yes. I mean,
so
that sounds unlikely, but essentially it's a non-fiction book with a bit of a fictional framework to it. Obviously, the creatures are, the night before the auction talking to each other, and that's...
As far as we know.
As far as we know, that's fictional. But every single historical character who appears, well, almost every single historical character who appears in the book is a real person who existed. And in many cases, the dialogue that I've put in their mouths is based on things that they wrote at the time. So, for example, Georges Cuvier, the father of paleontology, who appears in France, who is a very divisive figure in the scientific community even today. A lot of the things that he says in the book are based on things he actually said at the time. And yes, so as far as I possibly could, I wanted to make sure that the events that these creatures of mine were being placed into were real. And I didn't actually have to make it up, because as soon as you know yourself from writing historical fiction, as soon as you dig into it, you couldn't make that stuff up.
Yeah, that's right.
There are so many odd little things about history that are marvelous and, beautiful to explore as a writer. And you don't even, and if you're putting your own characters, as you've done as well, your characters that you've created into these real world situations, it's an absolute joy to do as a writer.
It's a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun. And you were talking in an interview I read, you said that the blessing and the curse of writing historical fiction is going down all of these little rabbit holes and on all these little tangents. And one of the little rabbit holes that you take us down in Mammoth, it involves a person called Paul Richard, who everybody here has heard of, but not by that name. And he turns out to be quite an influential part of Mammoth's character. So tell us about him.
Poor Richard, right? So there were a series of, I guess they're like literary journals almost that came out every year in America for quite a long time, written by this guy called Poor Richard, and they give advice about life, the weather, reviews. He would often start arguments with other prominent public figures of the day, but they were all written and published by Benjamin Franklin. And he actually made a fortune releasing this book, and people were desperate every year to get their hold of Poor Richard's Almanac when it came out, because sometimes he would begin a story or an argument and just it would tail off, and then you had to wait a year until the next issue of Poor Richard's Almanac came out to see the continuation of the story. So I thought, and he was a major inventor as well, so I thought it was nice to put in a bit of Poor Richard's Almanac. And the Mammoth essentially, because when he's being reassembled in Philadelphia, the men who are reassembling him, they often read to each other from Poor Richard's Almanac. So that was one of the places that he learned about humans and learned some odd phrases and how to speak English.
So he's got in his DNA, Mammoth has as a character Thomas Jefferson, he's got Benjamin Franklin, he's got Georges Cuvier, and he does speak very much like a rather dryly witted 19th century gentleman. But at one stage, there's an Irish aspect to this story, isn't there?
Oh, well, I knew you'd bring that up. Yeah, because the mammoth bones are stolen in France and they're transported to Ireland, and they unwittingly take part in the Second Irish Rebellion, where the rebels decide that the mammoth bones are quite a prize to have, and they need to raise some money. That didn't happen. The Irish Rebellion did happen. Yes. As you know, it also was a miserable failure. But I thought it was interesting that he happened to be in France the year before, and I needed him to come back to America for the Lewis and Clark expedition. So I was like, oh, well, Ireland's on the way, and it just happens to be the Second Irish Rebellion. So
why not stop in?
Well, that little part is, the events of the rebellion, I've tried to be as faithful as possible to history and the characters, and there's quotations from speeches that they gave in court and so on. So all of that was, a little bit of a way for me to talk about the probably lesser known Second Irish Rebellion against the English. And Mammoth is there as an observer. He's initially hidden in the Guinness brewery, but has to get out of there because there's an explosion.
Why not? But, we do see quite a bit of history which did actually happen through Mammoth's eyes. What do you think we learn about ourselves by looking at ourselves through the eyes of a species who we essentially killed?
Right. So Mammoth and his friends are essentially longtime observers of us humans. They've got that vantage point that we don't really have, and that they've been around for a very long time, observing our ancestors throughout the centuries, how we've behaved, how we've changed, the mistakes that we've made right up to the modern day. And their conclusion really is that we keep making the same mistakes and don't really seem to learn, really struggle to learn that our relationship with the natural world is not what it should be. We are constantly at odds with the natural world, and it doesn't really do us any favors. We tend to act like we have dominion completely over all the other creatures of the world, and that doesn't really work out for us, and hasn't really worked out for us. And still today, we have a very combative and aggressive relationship with the natural world. And it's probably, and as we've seen with COVID-19, continued interference with the animal kingdom, and eating creatures that we probably shouldn't be eating. It's ended up with lots of people dying. So the Mammoth and his friends essentially have a very dim view of us as as a species that is quite destructive and quite toxic to the environment and unable to change, although they do have their favorites. So there are some humans that they meet along the way who kind of change, who kind of offer some redeeming features for us as a species. So all hope is not lost, and I think the book has quite a positive, ultimately positive tone to it. In that that I think that people of intelligence and creativity and empathy will ultimately triumph over the people obsessed with greed and stupidity. I mean, maybe I'm naive, and maybe Mammoth is too, after all his years. But I think we do still hope. He and I both still hope that that we'll make it.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's a wonderful note, I think, to throw the floor open to questions if anyone has some. And just while people are getting ready with their questions, I also wanted to ask you if there were any other little things that you came across down those rabbit holes of yours that surprised you while you were researching.
There were lots of things that I discovered. As you know yourself, whenever you're trying to do historical fiction, you have a bit of an idea in mind and you try to keep on track, but there's all these things that pop up and you think, oh, should I put that in? Am I going too far here? Will this be too busy? I generally indulged myself. So it's a bit of a book of ideas. So any little odd things I discovered along the way, I tended to throw them in. There were a few points where I would come up against a bit of a brick wall and realize that I didn't know anything about a certain aspect of life. Some of the interesting things I discovered were that in 1801, 1802, I'm sure you remember the Irish character Kiva O'Neill, when she's in Paris. She's wearing a dress that is completely see-through whenever she stands in front of a candle. And it was called Nudity à la Grecque, and she is essentially dressed as a naked statue. And that was researched. We looked at, my partner and I looked at fashions throughout the early 1800s, and that's exactly what people wore then. Women were essentially dressed as beautiful nude statues, whilst the men had on these, very elaborate costumes.
Yes.
So I just love those kind of details about history, and it's great to throw them in.
Absolutely. Now we've got quite a few questions now. Samantha's wondering, was the concept a hard sell for your publishers, or did they get it straight away?
Right, that is a good question. The book was shopped around a few publishers, and to my surprise, I thought no one would be interested. I thought this is too bonkers, too left field. But everyone read it, and a lot of people were very interested in it. And I think maybe it's because they had maybe been reading a lot of the same things all the time. So when UQP got a hold of it, they were mad for it straight away. I have to say, they were instantly enthusiastic. I mean, they're a bit of they've got a bit of a reputation for being sort of quite cutting edge with the things that they publish anyway. So it maybe wasn't that much of a surprise that they were into a book about a talking mammoth, but they did get it straight away, and they were instantly enthusiastic and have been ever since. So once Mammoth found his home with UQP, it was plain sailing from then on.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I love the cover as well. It's just a fantastic cover.
Yes. So someone on Instagram today, I think a graphic designer from South Australia, wanted to know, they asked Dymocks who designed the cover. And I promised I might answer the question tonight. So the cover of Mammoth.
There you go. You get it in stereo.
The cover was designed by a sort of iconic design duo who live in Orange in New South Wales. They're called We Buy Your Kids. And it's Sunny Day and Biddy Maroney. They're sort of well-known graphic designers and illustrators. They do a lot of beautiful, retro movie posters. And I loved their work for years. And I thought, they'd be great if we could get them, but they'd never do it. But they were instantly enthusiastic for it as well. So yeah, it's a great cover. I love it. So I'm pretty happy that And plus, they've got the coolest name for a design duo, We Buy Your Kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Paige is just wondering, were you always interested in writing about the Ice Age and how much research you had to do? And Sarah is also asking how you did your research. So a couple of research questions there.
Yeah, the Ice Age wasn't necessarily something I was that interested in. I do have very clear memories of going to Natural History Museum as a child and being obsessed with, this is in Belfast, and being obsessed with the skeleton of a mammoth and dinosaur skeletons, and maybe subconsciously it entered my brain when I was 6 years old, and it took 40 years for that germ to for that seed to germinate and to finally blossom into the book. In terms of the research, there was more than I've ever done for anything in my life, really. I spent a good 3 years not writing a word of this book and just reading and being a bit scared of starting to write it. So I read a lot of internet research, and then you eventually come to a dead end sometimes with internet stuff, and you have to go to primary sources. So I would then get books out of the library. I ordered a lot of very obscure out of print books online and would read them. And I tried to be across as much as I possibly could before I sat down to write the book. But even then, as you know yourself, you think you've got it and you start writing, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, hold on. What did they drink in 1801? Bloody hell, I have to now go and find out what kind of tea they had then. So the research kind of never ends, really.
Yes, yeah, the past is another country, as they say. Malvina says it's a very novel concept. Thank you, Malvina. And Luke is wondering what you're going to do next.
Oh, yes, right. Okay, so how far into this should I go? Okay, so you asked a little bit earlier, Meg, about the things that you discover whenever you're researching and whether everything sort of goes into the book or not. I discovered something whilst I was researching this, and I quickly realized, oh, this is a different book. And so I'm developing that. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's probably not giving too much away because I'm quite far into this now. The idea of digging up bones and not knowing what they are occurs in this book because around about 1800, when they were digging up the mammoth and other dinosaur bones, people didn't really know what they were. And because these creatures didn't exist anymore, and that was a concept that was very alien to people, the idea of extinction. Because most people around about, the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century were still very religious. And even the men of science were also men of faith. And so the idea that God might allow something to not exist anymore, it just wasn't in their brains. And so they assumed that these bones must be of creatures that still existed somewhere in the world, or that they were obviously the bones of other creatures, of current creatures that had been muddled up. But eventually, people like Cuvier proposed the idea of an age of reptiles that had predated the age of man, where great creatures roamed the earth and there was no people around. And in 1800, people thought he was mad for proposing this. They didn't believe it at all. But what occurred to me when I was researching was, okay, this is 1800. But what happened whenever people dug up bones in the ancient world? So if you're in ancient Egypt, for example, and you dig up the bones of some dinosaur out in the desert, what are you going to think that is?
Yeah.
So the new book will be essentially working out how ancient people developed myths of creatures, mythological creatures, based on misunderstood dinosaur bones.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. Now we're being told it's last question, and Sue has a really interesting one, which is, if you were stuck in quarantine with one of the mammoth characters, who would you choose and why? And you think hopefully we can get Paige's just also got a question. So maybe, Dymocks, can we please have one more after that one from Paige? But first, Sue's question, if you were stuck in quarantine, who would you choose? Be very careful, they're all listening.
Yes, that's true. They're all still out there listening to us. Which creature would I choose, or which character would I choose? That is a tough one, isn't it? There's quite a selection. I'm tempted to say, just because he's quite funny and verbose and cynical, and I guess I probably see myself in the penguin a little bit.
This is the penguin who...
but he would drive you crazy,
This is the penguin who, when he's first mentioned by T-Batar says he's losing it and going, he says, there's this penguin jabbering in the next room, I'm concerned about him. So this is the character that you identify with.
Yeah, probably. I mean, you always find yourself somewhere in your books,
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Mammoth would be an interesting one because you'd certainly learn a lot, but you wouldn't get a word in.
Shall we do the question, what's the best piece?
Yes, that's the last one from Paige. What's the best piece of writing advice you've ever received?
That's a good question too. And I know exactly what the answer is. When I was quite young, I mean, I'm 48 years old now, and when I was in my early 20s and really keen to be a writer and, trying to write stories and really bad poetry and anything I could think of, and, terrible.
Oh, Chris, you've just frozen. There we go, you're back.
He basically said, don't worry about writing. Just go off and live. And you can worry about writing when you're older. And that way you'll have things to write about. And I think that was a very good answer to the question. Did you lose me for a minute there? Have you got me back?
We did. So that was excellent advice that you received, but I think we missed who you got it from. Who gave you that advice?
Oh, it was just a friend of mine in France who had written some articles, and he just proposed that I should go out and live rather than worry about writing. I should get some experience before I wrote anything, and it was very good advice, which I heeded, and then went and lived for quite a long time without doing any writing.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much, Chris. I love this book. Everyone should buy it. Everyone should read it. And it really is, despite the fact that there are some extremely heartstring tugging moments and a few confronting concepts, it really is a story about hope. And it is, as somebody said in the comments, the book the world needs right now. So I hope everyone enjoys it, and I hope you have great success with it, Chris.
Thank you, Meg. It's just had its second reprint, so it's doing okay for the moment. And
excellent.
It is a bit of a tonic, I think, and I don't mind the fact that a book like this is out in the middle of a pandemic. It's maybe not ideal to be releasing a book right now, but I actually don't mind. I quite like it because it's a bit of a uplifting fun and escapism, and I think that's something that we can probably appreciate now.
Definitely. Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks everyone for tuning in and for the great questions.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you to Dymocks for doing this wonderful Chapter 1 event. And thanks for your questions.
Okay. Night, everybody.